between Kenyatta and Nyerere, but the similarities are more striking. The difference is actually superficial. What are the similarities? Who created Kenya in its present boundaries, and who created Tanganyika in its present boundaries? Actually, who created Cameroon in its present boundaries? Us? No. Who created our state? This institution called state. The governments. Who decided that we should have government, we should have parliament, we should have judiciary, we should have presidents, we should have prime ministers? Who decided that? Who decided what type of police forces or militaries should we have? Or universities? Who decided that our countries should grow coffee and cotton and sisal and tea and export them to other countries? Who decided that you should speak English or she should speak French or Portuguese? Who decided those things?
So let me, Ali Mazrui.
That is to say, to what extent have we controlled our destinies if we speak seriously?
So I'm thinking now.
Who decided that the Kenyan currency should be called the shilling?
So I want you to push. I want to push you in one area. You
Yes.
are a presidential candidate. Given all of this you have mentioned,
Yes.
Mazrui talked about the triple heritage.
Yes.
We have Islam.
Yes.
We have Christianity, which is colonialism, and then you have African cultural.
Yes.
So, given those three, you are a presidential candidate.
Yes.
Where were you going to take Tanzania? Given all this, given that we speak English, given that we grow coffee, all these control that we have. So, what was your plan for Tanzania, and how was it different from Magufuli's?
Well, the differences of Magufuli's would be striking. I wouldn't do what Magufuli did.
Okay, so tell us what
everything that Magufuli did actually. I wouldn't kill people.
Okay.
I would muzzle the press. I wouldn't kill the opponents of my government. I wouldn't go on this spending spree in my home village like Mobutu or Felix Houphouët-Boigny.
So where were you going to take Tanzania?
I would have negotiated Tanzania's place in the sun in the midst of all these complexities. The world is much more complex than we imagine, or than we make it out. We don't have a lot of freedom in what we do because of these complexities. We cannot pretend, like Magufuli did, that actually the world owes us a living. It doesn't. All right? We need the world more than the world needs us. Seriously. So I would have been much more humble than Magufuli was. I would have been much more humble than Nyerere was actually. Or Kenyatta.
So we've seen a lot of African leaders make a lot of promises, and once they become like leader, president particularly, they completely forget their promises to the nation. In looking at all these challenges, complexity that we're navigating in all African countries, and even in Tanzania, which is one of my favorite countries.
Mhm.
So if you had become president, if you would become president, what would you do for the youth? Because the youth are the future. The youth are also our responsibility. What would you do particularly for the youth?
I think the reason why promises are made and they are not kept is because we've turned our people into beggars, and they have somehow accepted the idea of being beggars. Governments don't do this or that for people. People do things for themselves and for their countries. Governments get money from us, and then they come and build a road here, a school there, and they tell you that we have built this road for you or that school. You know, I think my idea of government and my idea of citizenship is that people should be demanding things from the demanding as opposed to begging. Government should not be doing things for people. Government should be made to do the things that people want. So our politics have been turned upside down in that way, in the sense that we have made our people believe that we should, once in government or in parliament, we will bring development to you, instead of people demanding that you do this and holding us to account if we don't. And because of that, that's why promises are not kept, because we have been reduced to spectators instead of being active participants in the processes of our own development and our own emancipation. So I look at it completely differently. Politicians will make promises which they will not keep if they are allowed to get away with it. It is not just Africa. Can we talk a bit about American politics? This force for good in the world. You know, how many leaders here keep their electoral promises? Actually, it is taken for granted here, and I don't live here. You do, but it is taken for granted here that politicians here will make bigger promises, and once in office they will steer clear from those promises.
Can I clarify my point again? Mm-hmm. I'm talking in terms of access to providing access to quality education for all, providing empowerment tools for them to to be knowledgeable about what they have the right to even demand for.
What government wants people to be empowered?
Thank you. So that's
what government in the world does that?
So that's
the
why
American
I'm asking.
government.
That's why I'm asking. Would your government be able to empower the youth to know
because
their rights?
It wouldn't, because it's a government. A government. The people in power, if left to their own devices, will behave badly. They will behave badly. They will behave in their own interests and the interests of those who put them in power. It is true in Tanzania. It is true in the United States. All right?
If you become a president for the people, but made by the people, what would you do for
If
the
the
people?
people sleep on their rights,
Oh, they would not be, okay.
So I think that's an interesting transition is Tanzania's constitution has been up for debate for some time now.
yes.
JK created forums where people could go and share their ideas with how to reshape the constitution.
Mhm.
And that process has essentially evaporated now. How do you think about the constitution building process then and the enumeration of rights by the government, even if the government never provides what it promises that it will provide?
We have been talking about constitutional reform for the past 30 years. 30 years. We went multi-party in 1992. And the year before that, the Presidential Commission, which was tasked with telling us how we should go multi-party, recommended that we should have a new democratic constitution. In their own words, they say the current constitution is essentially a one-party constitution. It cannot serve as a basis for a new national dispensation under a multi-party system. Now, those in power agreed to give us multi-party system, but they rejected the idea of a new constitutional order. And they have been consistent in rejecting those demands ever since. Kikwete opened up in 2011, between 2011 and 2014, opened up the constitution making process. I was in parliament then, and I was very much in the thick of things. And Kikwete wanted a new constitution which wouldn't change anything, really. It will be a new constitution, perhaps in title, and a few things, minor things, but the basic parameters of power would remain unchanged. The commission that he established came up with a model that he didn't like at all. A model which threatened to whittle away just a little, not by much, just a little, whittle away some of the basic parameters of state power. And Kikwete killed that process. Not Magufuli, that's what Magufuli said. Kikwete pretty much killed it because it held the danger of creating something that would have made their rule more difficult. And so we remain without a new constitutional order to this day. We talk a lot about it. In the past 1 year, my party has been involved in negotiations with the government over how to bring back the process that was stalled by Kikwete. And after 1 year of negotiations, a few months ago, they came up and said no to almost every position, every proposal we had negotiated with them for over a year. So those in power don't want change. The issue then is how hard are those without power prepared to fight to change things? That's where we are. We're going to have to get it the hard way. And the question then is, are we prepared for what it takes? Yeah. It will be hard. It will be dangerous. But that is the way it is working.
I attended some of those forums where there was public open discussion, and it was actually one of the most transparent forms of conversation I've ever seen about government.
Yes.
And that the feeling in those rooms at the moment, and I get your point that there was never any intention of change, but the feeling in the room from kind of a local level was incredible to see people think about the next step and what rights they wanted and how they would claim them and how the government could enforce them. And as a US citizen, I could never imagine being invited into a process like that. So the experience in Tanzania was incredibly, I found it very forward-looking and very hopeful. So I was very disappointed, of course, when it failed, although was not under any pretense that it was intended to succeed. But I will say it was such a cool process to be a part of.
I have said elsewhere that those 3 years are perhaps the most consequential years in our country's entire history since 1961. For once, there was a national conversation about the kind of Tanzania we want. The report of the commission, which runs into 13 fat volumes, is unprecedented in the depth of detail, and it's a process that was in many ways unprecedented in our entire history. And I love to think that it was not in vain. That process and the output it generated will continue to inform our conversation on democracy, on rights, on accountability for decades to come. So even though we don't have a new constitution still, I think that process was very important. It was very productive. We are not done with the process yet. Yeah.
And I think it's co-occurrence with other investigations and kind of public political airings at the same time, kind of mutually informed each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. Towards an air of transparency.
Swali lingine kaka?
Nafikiria ngoja kidogo.
Yes. The Kenyans, you Kenyans love to hate Jomo Kenyatta.
And his son.
And his family.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand perfectly that ambivalent attitude to the Kenyattas. The Kenyattas are the richest family in Kenya, if I'm not mistaken. And they are the richest family because the father, the patriarch, was the first president of Kenya after independence. And he used his presidency to provide for his family first, provide for his clan second, provide for his tribe's people third, and then whatever remained was the rest of Kenyans had to fend for themselves. And so that is my crude way of trying to understand Kenyatta and Kenya of the period. Nyerere didn't do that. Nyerere didn't do that. And Nyerere didn't do that because he was a son of a chief, and it's difficult to understand where he got these monkish traits. He was Mwalimu was completely unfazed by money, by idea of being rich. He was a very simple man. He led a very simple lifestyle. His family, you wouldn't recognize a Nyerere anywhere on the street in Tanzania. You would immediately recognize Samia Suluhu Hassan's son now, you know, a year or two after his mother became president, you know. You would recognize children of our former president immediately. They stand out. You wouldn't notice a Nyerere. And so Nyerere has become some kind of our secular saint, you know.
Not even secular. Isn't there a movement to get him real sainthood?
I think.
Or did it fail officially?
Thankfully, it did not succeed.
It did not succeed. Okay.
It did not succeed. My brother and I, my eldest brother, who's a lawyer, and I made a petition to our church fathers, and we said things about Nyerere that they hated us. but never mind. So
if he lived that much of a simple life, did not maybe corrupt the government or take the resources of the country to his own family,
No,
why
he did it.
isn't it then able? Why was it that good that he was not reinstated?
Mwalimu was a political leader, first and foremost. He was a state leader. And he was a leader of a very authoritarian state. In many ways, Mwalimu, and this is, I think, something to make people who think of Nyerere and Nkrumah as some kind of secular saints on the continent. Mwalimu created a state which was completely unaccountable to anyone. He did not steal, but he exercised powers in ways in which we were all completely disempowered. One of the first things he did in 1962, a year after independence, he changed the constitution to become president. Kenyatta learned from Nyerere, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And this Republican constitution, which made him the executive president, basically created a demigod, completely unaccountable to anyone. The institutions of state were all subsumed into the presidency. So you have the shadow of the presidency everywhere, in our parliament, in our judiciary, in our economy, in our lives. The shadow of the president is everywhere. And this is Nyerere's creation. He perfected the state that was created by colonialism. The colonial state was absolutely vicious. It was absolutely authoritarian, violent. Nyerere perfected that. And he took his wisdom from Kwame Nkrumah, because Kwame Nkrumah did that in 1960. Nyerere 62, Kenyatta 64, Obote 67, and the rest is history, right? So when we talk about our constitutional problems now, we have a president who has just given away all our ports to the Dubai Port World. You know, if you look at our constitution and our laws, the president doesn't have any powers to dispose of our public assets like that, but she just did. Why? Because she's the president. What the president says is the law of the land. What the Constitution and the laws in our statute books say are not important if they do not correspond with what the president wants. Now that state that imperial presidency is a creation of Julius Kambarage Nyerere. And we're still grappling with it today.
So how is that different from?
So you have let me finish
Okay.
my thought. So you had someone who occupied that office for 24 years, and he didn't steal. And then you have his successors, all of them, who exercised the powers that he created, and they have made themselves multimillionaires several times over. They have not changed. Samia has not changed the constitution. Magufuli didn't. Kikwete didn't. The last time we changed the constitution was in 2000, and to deal with other matters. But the presidency, the parameters of presidential powers are what they were, what they have been since 1962. And it is those parameters of power which have made it possible for a president to just give away national assets without much of a debate.
So I'm thinking about Africa before the colonizers came.
Yeah.
We had kingdoms, we had chiefdoms, all of which were similar to that. Somebody
We
with,
didn't have chiefdoms.
well, some sort of.
These chiefs are the creation of British.
Yeah, but when I'm talking about chiefdom, I'm talking about smaller. They were not large enough to be kingdoms, but they were small where they had an authority figure, which was very similar to what you're saying, where somebody has absolute control, absolute power over everything. So I'm thinking about a vision of Africa going forward. What could it look like? What can we learn from? I've read where people say democracy, multi-party democracy is not good for Africa. So what's your vision for Africa going forward? How should we lead this continent going forward, given all that we've talked about?
Well, those who say that multi-party democracy is not good for Africa are either people who did not live under one-party rule, I did, or the people who were in control of the one-party system and they are abettors, or they are intellectual justifiers. Those are the ones who will say multi-party democracy is not good for Africa because they did not live under the yoke of one-party rule. You Kenyans did.
Mm-hmm.
Would you tell me that the Moi years were the golden, or the Kenyatta years were the golden age in Kenya?
So what's our way going? What's our way forward?
Well, our way going forward is we should try to reconcile all these complexities of our history and of our current situation. We find ourselves in boundaries which we did not create, but which we cannot undo. We find ourselves with institutions of governance which we did not create, but which somehow we cannot do away with. We have to find ways of changing them for the better. We have to find ways of improving them. We find ourselves using languages which are not ours. We have to find a way of surviving, or perhaps getting some of what we lost back. But can we do with this cultural heritage which was imposed on us? I don't think we can. I don't think we are not. I think we're still going to be speaking English 500 years from now, somehow. It is a heritage that we somehow cannot do. So we have to find ways of negotiating all these complexities and finding our place, in the larger scheme of things. And we have to find ways of coexisting with the larger world. We cannot do without it. We can't.
I have a question.
Yes.
I wanted to go back to her point on promises that leaders make, and then when they get into power, they don't keep them. Is that not a lose-lose situation, given the fact that we don't own our governments? European countries tend to have greater influence on what we do in our countries than our own. So it's not necessarily that you keep your promise, but you will always have somebody over your shoulder to tell you what you need to run your government like. So how would you not do that? For example, this might be a touchy subject for some, but like most people fall into puppet governments due to the fact that you have people like Thomas Sankara and Gaddafi who end up dying if they put their countries first. So it's a fear factor of you do what is for your people, or you do what will keep you alive and in power. So how would you differ from those? Or what promise, not necessarily promise, but how would you be trusted to not fall victim to other forces within African governments in general?
That's a very difficult question. How do you survive in a very hostile world? Hostile if you don't play according to their rules. If you don't play according to the rules-based international order. Yeah? It's a very difficult subject. The subject that is how many of our leaders don't do what they are supposed to do, what they commit to do, because they fear being overthrown by the CIA? Because it is the CIA which overthrows governments. It's not the KGB, by the way. It's not Putin. All right? How many of our leaders oppress us because they fear being overthrown by the types of CIA?
For us, is France. So Macky Sall, when he was elected, I was in elementary school. That was like 14 years ago. And when he was elected, he did start to do what he promised. However, he started to feel the heat of he's not doing what our French counterparts want us to do. And he started to forget his influence that he had. He started putting his family members in power and in parliament. And
Was that because of the French?
I believe so.
Well, I don't believe so. I believe it has become a very convenient excuse for our leaders and some of us to justify bad behavior on the basis of the argument that, if they behave well, they will be overthrown. I think our leaders are corrupt because it is very profitable to be corrupt, and it is safe. It's actually safe to be corrupt. It is safe for the French interests in West Africa, for African Francophone leaders to be corrupt, because then they will not touch the basic interests of the French, economic and otherwise.
So then if it is safe for them, then how is it not French?
So the question is, it is not that our leaders behave badly because they fear treading on French interests. They behave badly because it is in their interests, it's in their fundamental interests and it is also in the fundamental interests of the French and other outside powers for them to be corrupt. All right. It is not because they fear being overthrown. They are bosom friends with the people who occupy Elysee Palace. Okay. Leopold Sédar Senghor.
The first president.
Yes. He was Senegalese president, while at the same time was a French citizen. When he retired in 1981, where did he go? Did he stay in Dakar to be taken care of in his old age by the Senegalese people? He went back home,
He wouldn't have had that option.
as did Ahmadou Ahidjo in Cameroon.
Ahidjo died in Senegal.
I think Ahidjo died in Senegal.
He died in Senegal.
But as did, well, Ahmadou, where is Abdou Diouf, your second president?
He still lives
Where
in
does
France.
he live? He lives in France. All right? Where?
Same as the
What
Cameroonian
about
president.
Paul Biya?
Paul
Paul
Biya.
Biya lives in Switzerland.
No, he doesn't go to Switzerland anymore because Cameroonians stopped him.
Okay.
But he used to live in Switzerland more than he lives in Cameroon.
Felix Houphouët-Boigny. All right? And I could name them all. They see themselves first and foremost as Frenchmen.
I mean, all African presidents, especially the French-speaking African presidents, are all French citizens to start with.
Yes.
With their children, with their children.
So are those people fearful of being overthrown by the French version of the CIA? I don't think so.
You have to fear to be.
It is in their interest. It is in their interest.
But
So
even
it is
with
not-
interest, though,
Yeah.
even with interest, though,
Mhm.
there's still an influence. You don't have to have fear
Oh, they are.
to have influence. So the issue is there isn't a fear of being overthrown. There's a fear of your life is in danger, your family's life is in danger because you don't do what they say. And regardless of that, it's in their best interest because when you do what they say, there's no trouble for you and your family, who is what you're going to think of first, not
They-
your people.
I
They
don't
retire
think-
to French country
Mhm.
because there is no place for them in Senegal where they have done the people wrong
Mhm.
for French interests, ever.
Actually, I don't think these leaders even think of doing anything anti-French. Remember in 1958, the French asked Francophone Africa whether they should accept independence? And only Sékou Touré said no. All of them said, no, we cannot do without France. Okay? And 2 years
And
later,
then
they
what
were-
happened to Sékou Touré?
well, the French tried to destroy him. Yeah, no doubt about it. But I'll come back to you. But they said no. In fact, they were given independence. They were almost unwilling. They were given independence because Washington was pressing hard for the French to decolonize, so that American capital would be able to penetrate those countries without having to negotiate with France. So our leaders, those types of our leaders, the idea of acting against French interests does not even appear in their horizon because they see themselves first and foremost as Frenchmen.
So whose fault is that?
Well, I'm not here to apportion blame. I'm trying to explain and to understand.
So, as a leader in Tanzania, what would you do different as compared to the French-speaking president?
Well, we are very different to begin with. I mean, we do things differently. Not better. I'm not saying we do things better, but you wouldn't find the kind of Francophilia that you find in Francophone Africa. You wouldn't find it in the Anglophone world. Not because we don't like the British, but because the British worked very hard not to make us British.
try to federate.
The British colonialism was very different in a way from French colonialism. The British were less about civilizing us natives. They were more about getting whatever resources they could get and get out before we started rebelling. Okay? So you wouldn't find programs that were common in French colonialism, where natives who were sufficiently civilized could become French citizens. We didn't have that. We didn't have assimilation. The British didn't have assimilation. You were colonies. You were to be exploited. If you got education, it was because it was necessary to make your exploitation more efficient. It wasn't because they wanted to civilize you, because they wanted to exploit you more effectively. So they were different. The French tried to create Frenchmen out of their colonized people. So that is the difference.
So you say instead of
And the Portuguese too.
So then the way that Francophone countries run and the way Anglophone countries run, you would have a better chance of changing what is wrong because you don't have, not necessarily the issue, but the person over your shoulder, the way that Francophone governments have, essentially. Like, is there hope for you to actually bring change to your country because you don't have a country like France that still has their influence within our countries?
It is easier for us, I would say, and I say it with a lot of care, treading on a minefield here. It's easier because we don't have this baggage in our heads that we want to be French. So I think it is easier for us that way. Our leaders don't aspire to go live in London after they retire. They don't aspire to be British citizens. West African, Francophone West Africa, these presidents, like I said, quite a few of them have been, and some of them still are, French citizens. The idea of being French is very good for them. It's different for us. So we are different in that regard.
Raise a hand over there.
I mean, in terms of changing, in terms of change, I think change always starts with the head. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. Bob said, yeah. So if in your head you still see yourself as a Frenchman or woman, you are in bigger trouble than someone who thinks that they are on their own. They are their own people. Yeah. You wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make a general comment based on what I've been hearing. I'm David, by the way. Sorry I'm late. I just came from physical therapy. So I think this conversation is interesting, but I think that everyone should look at it with a bit more nuance in the sense that, for instance, I think what you're trying to say is the French have a lot to blame, which I agree. And I do think that most African countries have a chip on their shoulder, but it's not necessarily another country. Like Nigeria doesn't pay taxes to the UK, or for instance. But there are entities that their interest is directly against the progress of a country, like the French and Senegal. I can list a number of people that have stood up against companies like, I don't know, Shell and Chevron that extort certain places in Nigeria, and they actually have killed those people or have done things to them just because it's in their best interest to exploit Nigerians, or and if we're still on that, for instance, I think every country has their own thing where if someone stands up and tries to do something better for the country, it's in the best interest that that doesn't happen because it's cheap for them. Like at DRC, for instance, right? They produce a huge, copious amounts of, say, cobalt, right? Which is important for our phones and our technologies, right? If the leader wakes up one day and says, let's start taking care of these miners, let's start giving them homes and paying for education for their children, and let's actually make sure children don't work, right? Look at the companies that benefit from the cheap labor, Apple, Samsung, all of those big companies. They would start making their connections lobby against that. Next thing you know, someone is dead, right? And so I just wanted to make that point. And I also want to make another point, which is that most African leaders are corrupt, not because they're scared of this. A lot of people, like you said, don't even think that far. It's something I've definitely thought about, and I thought if there's any good leader that's trying to make positive change in African countries, they would have to find a way to not be killed or to make sure their family aren't killed, right? I don't think most African leaders that are currently in power think of that. I think they only think of what's in their best interest. And it's not just the leaders. It's if you put the average person from those countries in power, they will do the exact same thing. You know, they'll just settle themselves, settle their families, have enough money for generations upon generations and generations. Although, from my limited knowledge, because I'm from Nigeria, I'm not from a francophone African country, I don't think they pledge their allegiance to France or something. I think it's the most convenient for them, right? If they're on the good side of France, they can extort their countries as much as possible. If they're on the good side of France, they can go to a country that's not suffering like theirs when they want to retire. I don't think they pledge allegiance to France. I just think it's most convenient for them. So again, just to summarize what I'm trying to say, I think the corruption is definitely something that has to do with the individual. I don't think it's necessarily an allegiance thing, but I think it's just the most convenient for them. Although on the other hand, I must say most African countries have a chip on their shoulder that even when people want to do better, that is preventing them from doing so. Just food for thought. Everything is very nuanced.
I was going to say, I don't think it's unique to African countries either. If you look at the ways in which Congress people in the U.S. have been able to enrich themselves through contracts while also holding power, it's the same, right? It's not unique to a particular continent, but an access to power.
It's not an innately African thing. Yeah. But on the subject of allegiance, as I said, I don't know if you were here, but I say that we have had leaders, African leaders, African presidents, Leopold Sédar Senghor, Abdou Diouf is still alive, Houphouët Boigny, and many others who were French citizens while serving as presidents of their own countries. I thought if you're a citizen, you owe allegiance to the country of your citizenship. Right on?
You could argue that.
Okay? But you're right. They are what they are because it is in their fundamental interest to behave that way. And that's what I said. We have developed, I think it's being colonized and also gives you all sorts of excuses. We have developed a habit, it has become almost second nature to us, of blaming every problem of ours to our former colonial masters. While it is true at a very general level, but every oppressive system always depends on local abettors, local accomplices. Jesus Christ could not have been crucified by the Romans had it not been for Caiaphas and the church fathers, right?
Thomas Sankara.
Not Thomas Sankara, not just Thomas Sankara. For for every country you can name, you will always have accomplices. Every country. Every country. So it is not just, and that is a problem. The problem is, it then becomes easier to blame the powers that we don't see, because who killed Thomas Sankara, by the way?
His best friend.
His best friend, Blaise Compaoré. All right? Yes, the French may have been behind it, and Felix Houphouët-Boigny across the border, and the CIA perhaps, but who pulled the gun? Who killed Patrice Lumumba? The CIA was behind it all? Yes. The Belgians were involved? Yes. And the French? But who actually killed Lumumba? Who took him out from wherever they captured him into Katanga and executed him? All right? So we have to find, while it is correct to put a fair share of blame to those who exercise power from behind the scenes, it is just as important to deal with those who aid and abet them. And we don't do that sufficiently enough. It's always the case when you start dealing with our tyrants, everyone tells, but, what about the imperialists? Yes. How does imperialism operate locally? Who makes it possible for those with money in London, in Paris, in New York, and elsewhere, and in Beijing nowadays, who makes it possible for them to exploit our resources? Who makes it possible for the mineral wealth of DRC or of Tanzania to be siphoned off to these multinational corporations of the West? The local accomplices. The local accomplices. Those are ours. We have to deal with this. Because the people they work on behalf of are hardly ever seen. We don't see them in our parliaments. We don't see them in our White Houses. We have our White Houses too. You don't see them in our courts. You don't see them in our media. We have to understand. We have to understand our problems in their complexities. Foreign influence, yes, but how does it operate locally? Yeah.
Thank you so much for your visit. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I'm just so very grateful that you could join us today. In fact, we have a gift for you. Let me go. I will be right back. I apologize. Thinking about a conversation. Okay, I need my card, otherwise I won't feel good.
Unaitwa nani bwana?
Mimi.
Peter. Peter Moi. Wa wapi?
Wa Kenya, Western Kenya. Kakamega, unajua
Kakamega.
Kakamega?
Nafahamu Kakamega. Okay. Sawa sawa. Sawa sawa. Na mimi naenda sana na Kenya siku hizi. Na marafiki wengi sana.
Marafiki wa serikali ama
Wa serikali, wa opposition, everyone. Lots of friends. Yes. Lots of friends. Last year or this year, kulikuwa na uchaguzi. Sio mwaka huu.
Last year.
It was last year.
Yeah.
I had trouble, taking sides.
Because of friends.
Because of friends on both sides,
Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so grateful for your conversation and your time and your information. So thank you on behalf of Max. Very sort of great.
Can I have a look at it?
You can. There's one more piece that you will get tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Asante.
Asante nawe.
You're right.
Tunashukuru sana.